Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name is Fran Fuller. I'm the Director of Climate Analytics North America Office. Recognize that today is probably one of the busiest days of the whole week, so thank you very much for taking your time to join us for a really important conversation in a very important year. And thanks to everybody joining online as well. For those of you who are less familiar with climate analytics, we are a global science policy institute dedicated to aligning climate action with the 1.5 long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. We have offices in Berlin, New York, the Caribbean, Africa, South Asia, and in Australia that covers Australia and the Pacific. And our mission is really to connect the science and policy to support vulnerable countries, to inform international negotiations, and to deliver practical solutions on the ground. Just want to highlight a few of our key team members here. So for those of you who are maybe less interested in my portfolio, I'll tell you about the others. We have our climate policy team here, including some of our lead modelers, our chief scientist, a couple of people from our science team, including loss and damage experts, our diplomacy team who cover SIDS and LDC support, and also the head of our South Asia and Caribbean office. And then, of course, other team members who cover climate diplomacy, climate justice, energy policy, etc. And as a bit of a taste of our work, we cover a variety of issues, from climate policy analysis, including, for example, the Climate Action Tracker, which many of you know, through to work on the ground on adaptation, limits to adaptation, loss and damage, risk, and then also access to finance issues. So just a little context of this year before I hand over to Piers, who's going to set the scene a bit better than I will. Just this summer, many of you will know that the International Court of Justice issued a monumental advisory opinion affirming that 1.5 is the primary goal under the Paris Agreement, and that states have a duty to act with the highest ambition to achieve that. Science has been telling us that we're off track, and as countries are now 5 years into implementation of the Paris Agreement, global emissions still remain high, warming is brushing dangerously close to the 1.5 degree limit, and the window to avoid dangerous overshoot is really rapidly closing. And last but not least, NDCs are due this year with 2035 targets, should be informed by the outcome of the first global stocktake, including hopefully reflecting on their 2030 targets, and many of which will be announced tomorrow at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit. Subsequent to this, the UNFCCC is going to prepare their census report, and we have Bernd here to talk a little bit about that in the panel, and to inform, hopefully, the discussions on mitigation ambition in the upcoming COP. 10 years on, the Paris Agreement did, however, move the ball down the field, and it has given us a concrete framework to work in, the ambition and the benchmarks to work against. Now the challenge is to how we hold the line on 1.5 before that door closes and we move into a space of concrete conversation on overshoot. Hence the conversation, or the focus of our conversation today. And so we'll start with a quick message from our CEO. And to note that we are being recorded, it is live streamed, just to let you all know that that's gonna be online. And if we, oh, I forgot that I have control of this. Sorry, I can't actually see this.
I'm Bill Hare, and this is the importance of the 1.5 degree warming limit. The principal goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming, and the language is legally complicated. It's to hold warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees. In shorthand, though, the takeaway message is that the Paris Agreement is aiming to limit global mean warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. And that's now the scientific and legal consensus. The very important advisory opinion on climate change of the International Court of Justice has reinforced the centrality of the 1.5 degree limit in the Paris Agreement as a guide to action by countries and companies and anyone else who needs to take action. There's another important provision of the Paris Agreement in relation to climate goals, and that's the net zero goal. This is in another article of the Paris Agreement, and it requires countries to work together to bring greenhouse gas emissions to net zero in the second half of the century. Net zero is a really important concept at the global level, something that many people don't really appreciate, but that was very strongly negotiated by the vulnerable countries because the small island states, for example, needed to see warming peak and drop in order to minimise the risk of really massive sea level rise. That's the only way that we can really stop or avoid or minimise the risk of multi-metre sea level rise in the next century or two, is by getting warming dropping. And that's why net zero is one of the most important provisions of the Paris Agreement that complements the 1.5 degree limit temperature goal. The Paris Agreement has done a lot for the world. If you look at it in climate space, if you like, when we negotiated the Paris Agreement, countries were looking at the collective effect of their actions would have literally cooked the planet, warmed it by 3.5 to 4 degrees. Now, after a decade, that's down to below 3 degrees, 2.7 to 3 degrees, say. So that is progress. It's frustratingly slow progress, and it's not enough, but it is progress. And I think that's really important to recognise. Another really big important thing that the Paris Agreement brings to the world is it brings the world together. It's a multilateral place, the universal global place where countries, corporations, civil society, scientists can discuss and debate and work on actions. Because it's a UN agreement, a full multilateral agreement, means that the smallest countries can deal with the biggest countries at the same level. It literally is the only place in the world where Tuvalu can look at China across the table at the same level and get the same level of respect. There's simply no other place in the world where that can happen. And the political dimension to that is that ultimately we see at the moments in history where things have moved forward on the climate front, it's the vulnerable countries that have embarrassed the big countries into action, one way or the other. And that can only happen right now through the Paris Agreement. There's no other place we can do that. I know there's a lot of discussion as the world has reached 1.5 degrees for a few years that limit might no longer be relevant, but there's a couple of reasons why it remains more relevant than ever. So what's for sure is it's definitely a legal, moral and political boundary encoded in the Paris Agreement, and the force of that was reinforced by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. And the physical limits implied in 1.5 degrees, or that would be approached at 1.5 degrees, these are looking increasingly serious. We've learned a lot about the limits of a lot of systems to warming, and we know that 1.5 degrees is emerging as a kind of critical threshold. 3 good examples might be the triggering of the collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. We're very close to that now, close to 1.5 degrees warming. That would lead to multi-metre sea level rise, maybe within a century or two. Right? Really big disaster globally. The tripping of the Amazon rainforest, the conversion of the Amazon rainforest through warming and deforestation to a dry savanna with loss of biodiversity, loss of livelihoods and all the services that go with it, is also likely close to or slightly above 1.5 degrees. The third issue is the coral reef issue. So for coral reefs, we know that by the time you get to 2 degrees warming, you probably have lost the lot. Let's say 99% of reefs would be bleached and unable to recover from successive marine heat waves. 1.5 degrees, 70 to 90% loss is projected some years ago. And I would note that in the last year or so, we've had a massive global bleaching event that has caused between 70 and 90% mortality of coral reefs globally, right? In other words, the science got it right. And the question is whether or not they have tipped permanently at 1.5 degrees. I'm hoping not, but that's another boundary.
Bill, our co-founder and CEO, apologizes for not being here. He's stuck in Australia at the moment, and he's definitely having a bit of FOMO and not being able to be in the action of New York Climate Week, especially during this year. So with Bill having set the tone of the conversation and showcasing why climate analytics, this is our core mission and why it's so important to us, we are going to hand over to Dr. Piers Forster, who's going to be providing a bit of a science backdrop for the discussions. Piers is one of the world's leading climate scientists and founding director of the Priestley Centre for Climate Futures. Piers will present a few of the latest findings on where we're at as it relates to 1.5, some of the risks of overshoot, and some of the other analysis that he's been working on around indicators. So Piers.
Well, okay, it's fantastic to be here today. I can't see my slides at all, so I'll just place what's on them. I wanted to talk about my two jobs. So for my day job, I'm a climate scientist, but I also sit on the UK Government Change Committee, UK Climate Change Committee, and that is the committee that directly advises the UK government on its emission reduction targets and its NDCs. Great, that's a great job. Thank you very much. I hope all of you can see that now. So I'm going to talk about those two jobs. But first, let's look at the science. And just as Bill said in his introduction, I want to talk about our understanding of the way science has changed and the evidence has changed since that Paris Agreement was signed. I think we have far better evidence of the impacts of climate change, and in particular, a lot of the impacts, especially to ecosystem, as Bill talked about, cold, for example, as one, and the Amazon perhaps as another one. The impacts are considerably worse than we thought at the time the Paris Agreement was signed. And the other thing we are beginning to understand, that to try and bring temperature down to get to that net zero target for greenhouse gases, which we want to do to begin to cool the Earth a little bit, we have to deploy carbon dioxide removal, and the technologies are looking less sustainable and a lot more limited than we thought they were. And that's for both nature-based solutions, which are more kind of vulnerable to the threats of climate change, but also for the technological removals as well. So what that does is really tell us and the world that the more we go past 1.5 degrees, the far more dangerous it becomes, and it will be far more difficult to try and get temperatures back down again afterwards. But I think, like, you have to be in this game for so long, you have to be optimist. So, and the optimistic changes as well has occurred, and perhaps the most important one is that we do really understand a lot of the technology, nearly all the technologies we have to deploy to try and get to that net zero. And these are proving, thanks to colleagues in China and other countries, that the technology are becoming more economical to deploy all the time. And this was complete coincidence that I put up this slide from the International Court of Justice. We all on the same page, but I think this does emphasize the way the science has changed, that it is, when we talk about well below 2 degrees, we do really want to, the evidence indicates, we want to try and keep those temperatures to 1.5 degrees as much as possible. But of course, that's what the science said, but we have to rely on observations of where we are currently. And where we are currently is not looking good, unfortunately. So this graph shows a plot of the seasonal cycle of the Earth's surface temperature, and it shows the 2024 temperatures and the 2025 temperatures, and for the first time, the 2024 temperatures got above that 1.5 degrees. And 2025 temperatures are interesting. They aren't probably quite as warm as their 2024 temperatures were. Thankfully, they're sort of beginning to come down a little bit, but as you can see, not very much. So what I want to talk about is this bottom-up project that myself and colleagues began, which was to try and look at all the observational data sets out there, basically, and to try and put them together in a very similar way to the Intergovernmental Panel Report on Climate Change does. But these IPCC reports only come out every 7 to 8 year time frame, and because it is such an urgent situation, we want to produce more up-to-date data. And this is work done by about 60 colleagues from 30 institutes in kind of 17 different countries. But what we are doing is synthesizing the data project, the data product out there. But it is worth taking time, in fact, to think about what the science community have done with support to their kind of governments over a very long time to go out there, build satellites, put floats at depth in the ocean to record ocean temperatures, to have a look at the greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere very carefully, different locations in time. And that huge data collection is so valuable for global society, where we have to keep it free, robust, and give the highest quality data possible to our decision makers in the negotiations to try and make the best policy decision possible. So I think the data is under threat more than ever before currently. So I just want to really kind of thank my colleagues everywhere for producing these great data sets. Okay, but I thought I would just give you some of the key results for some of the indicators we talk about. You probably can't see what they are from the back here. I'll just walk you through some of the key ones. So the whole purpose of this is to not just look at the observed changes, but to try and quantify the human contribution to the temperature changes and the climate change we are observing. So we do go on your left-hand side of the picture, we do go from the emissions through to the concentration changes in the greenhouse gases, through some ones to do with the way the Earth's energy balance changing, and then observed temperature change going up by about 13%. And then the one we're interested in is the human contribution to climate change, that temperature change. So I want to look at these ones, and this shows the percentage change since the last IPCC report was published in 2021. And you can see that they're really all going in the very wrong direction, unfortunately. And the only indicator that has kind of reduced is the one we don't want to be reducing, which is the remaining carbon budget for a 50% chance of keeping temperatures to that 1.5 degree target, and that is now only about 130 gigatons of carbon dioxide, 130 billion tons, and that has come down from kind of 500 to 130 in the last 4 or 5 years, and that is about 3 years left at current emissions, and that was from the 1st of January. So this shows how close we are essentially to getting through that 1.5 degrees. Yeah, so I got quantified some things on this diagram. So we're emitting over 50 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually. Last year we were just over 1.5 degrees, but if you look at the human contribution, we are still thankfully just below that 1.5 degree target. If we look at the last 10 year average, we're about 1.2 or just above that. But if we look at last year's and estimate what that human contribution was, it's 1.36 degrees. I think the most alarming thing from my concern is that we're now warming the Earth at an unprecedented temperature change of about 0.227 degrees centigrade per decade. Yeah, and I think it's worth stopping to think about. We're seeing these unprecedented rates, but it's also interesting to think, in fact, that I want to say that Donald Trump in his speech today is incorrect. I mean, he said that we weren't any good at making kind of predictions, but if you have a look at the indicators, they are almost exactly what we predicted would occur for the current rate of emissions. So he's definitely incorrect. But quite a lot of some of the activists are also incorrect as well, because some people say that climate change is going much quicker or much worse than we thought, but in fact that's probably not correct either. These are changes that are unprecedented, but they are certainly very much in line with our kind of projections. Yeah, so I just talked about them. I won't go on about that, but I sort of want to, and I gave you an introduction to the climate science. I do want to now quickly segue into my more political job, which is advising the UK government. So the job of our committee is a very important one. It's to try and give the best available evidence on the kind of science and economy and society to try and get government to set an ambitious climate target. So we advise government on what a climate target should be, and the way that we do that is try and recommend these five-year carbon budget emission reduction caps for the country. And the other job we have got is to recommend NDC targets for the country. And to date, in fact, we're quite a powerful committee. And when we set our targets, they become legally binding for the country. And to date, respected governments have always accepted the committee's advice and accepted the NDC advice and accepted the carbon budget advice. And the first thing to say about it, this kind of framework of really translating the international commitment to on-the-ground policy in countries does really work to accelerate change. So since we have the carbon budget framework, we have doubled the rate of decarbonisation in the UK. And it's still a bit uncertain, but we do have quite a good chance of delivering our NDCs. We still need government to introduce policies. They aren't doing everything we want them to do, but we're more or less on track, in fact, to really deliver to our NDC commitments. It's quite interesting because the first thing I had to do on the committee when I joined in 2018 was to give the recommendation for the first NDC commitment, and that's 68% reduction. And sort of we had the conversation with Boris Johnson, the kind of Prime Minister at the time, and he said, I want the most ambitious NDC of any country in the world. And so he said, I want to do kind of 75%. We said, Boris, you won't be able to deliver that, mate, you know. So we sort of had to say to him, look, Boris, we think it's possible to deliver this 68% reduction, but we did have a little bit of an argument. And it was interesting when we got the government to accept the 81%, we almost had the opposite argument with the government. We did really have to convince them that 81% was a deliverable target. And so we put a lot of work into doing that. And I won't get into details, but as a lot of the world were worried about in the UK currently, we're worried about our economy. So we spent a lot of time convincing them that it was a very cost-effective thing to do to decarbonise the economy. You have upfront cost, of course, but eventually the operating cost, particularly the switch to electric transport, can really benefit the economy. And then by the time you get to 2035, 2040, the economy in the UK will be really benefiting to the tune of about an extra 30 billion. Is it 30 billion? Yeah, 30 billion pounds or so annually. And of course, the transition will be different in different countries, but the whole idea behind this is to really show it in the interest of our economies to transition. Yeah, so and I think they just so we're to deliver our NDCs and deliver net zero, we do have to urgently accelerate from where we are today. This shows the rollout of offshore wind in the UK, electric cars and heat pumps, but in each country will be a bit different. But we have to accelerate changes, but I think they're entirely possible to do. Yeah, so this says now, that just showed you that we think in the UK it is it is possible to get to our net zero target and hit our NDC targets in a way that's good for our economy. It's going to be different in each country, of course, and the whole idea of net zero and the whole kind of Paris Agreement thing is that you have to have NDCs that really do this effectively to really transition this greenhouse gas increases, these carbon dioxide increases from today, to really get them to turn the curve and come down those net zero targets. But I think it's really possible to do. And if you look at the different countries like China and India, we're beginning to see some really systemic changes in their economies. So I thought I'd finish with my ubiquitous ChatGPT cartoon. So this is the way that I think about the 1.5 degree target. So I see it as a real anchor point for the policy negotiations. Just because we're still pumping out greenhouse gases, we're going to go right past that 1.5 degree target. But if we have good, strong NDCs committed by countries, we hopefully won't go too far past that target. And then if we don't go too far past that target, the anchor, the NDCs, can potentially pull us back from the brink and toward 1.5 degrees in time. Okay, thank you.
I think first of all, we'll maybe open the floor for a couple of clarifying questions from Piers, if there are any, before we move on to the panel discussion. Piers, thanks very much. You said you were going to explain that picture, but I think it was very self-explanatory as well. Are there any initial questions from the floor before we go to the panel? Obviously, we'll end up with a Q&A with the entire panel, which Piers will also be on. Very clear.
Done and dusted.
So then we'll swap places. And so thanks, Piers, very much. You can just go ahead and take a seat. We're gonna, you can jump in. So I think that it's painted a picture of where we're at, where we're not on track, and why the 1.5 temperature limit of the Paris Agreement is still so critically important for the conversations that we're having. Like Piers, there are a few others in the room who've been navigating that same discussion in their national climate change committees or bodies, and hopefully we'll see the fruits of that labor tomorrow, or you would have seen them on the UNFCCC website already. So as we move into the next phase, we're going to be having a bit of a discussion with some really great panelists to explore what overshoot means, risks for ecosystems, health, tipping points, vulnerable countries, what the science says we must do as it relates to emission cuts, what are the key levers that we need to tap into, and then also looking then at the politics, path forward, what does that mean for finance, what does that mean for the COP, and not just on climate finance, but the broader ecosystem that is surrounding our transition. So please come to the podium and join us. We have Professor Piers Forster, who we had an introduction, Dr. James Fletcher, who is CARICOM Climate Envoy and was one of the key AOSIS negotiators during the Paris Agreement. Bernd Hackman, Dr. Bernd Hackman, UNFCCC Mitigation Division, who's also leading work on NDCs and LT-LEDs, as well as the NDC synthesis report. So if you have any burning questions, he's the one to to ask. And then Dr. Simona Minescu. Simona has been an advocate for developing countries, including CIDS, was the regional coordinator in the Pacific for a while, and has been a strong advocate for a multidimensional vulnerability index, as well as cross-cutting access to finance issues for vulnerable developing countries. And most recently is a UN senior advisor for the CIDS agenda in the UN, the Antigua and Barbuda agenda for CIDS. So round of applause, and please join me. So as we noted in the beginning, today is an extremely busy day, and so Piers is going to have to pop off to another event, and we're going to have a climate analytics colleague join us in your place, not necessarily replacing your physicist brain, but coming from a different angle. And so with that, I wanted to ask kind of a framing question, and I open it up as to who might want to jump in. 10 years on from the Paris Agreement, which enshrined the 1.5 temperature limit, what does that achievement mean today to you, to your area of work, especially with the risk of overshoot front and center and the fact that we are all, well, I say we all collectively have to submit NDCs this year? Ambassador Fletcher, do you want to take this one first?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess when we were negotiating 1.5 in the Paris Agreement, first of all, nobody thought, except maybe the community of small island developing states, thought it was possible. We went into Paris with, I think the world clearly set on 2 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal. But for us, 2 degrees Celsius was never an option. We made the point that 2 degrees Celsius was a death sentence for small island developing states. So one of the things that gave us the most joy, I think, in the final text of the Paris Agreement was seeing 1.5 degrees Celsius referenced as the long-term temperature goal. For us, it was never 2 degrees Celsius. It was never well below 2 degrees Celsius. It was always 1.5. And we made the point at 1.5 was not a safe limit. It wasn't that once we kept below 1.5, we were safe. We were already seeing impacts back then. I think 2015, Dominica was hit by Tropical Storm Erica that destroyed 90% of Dominica's GDP. 2 years later, Dominica was hit by Hurricane Maria that destroyed 226% of its GDP, and Hurricane Irma that destroyed over 300% of the BVI's GDP. You know, we'd seen devastating droughts, so we knew that we could not, and the science had proven it, that we could not really deal with anything above 1.5 degrees Celsius. I remember negotiating together with the late Tony DeBrun, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, and Tony was making the point to me that whereas there is some retreat for a country like mine in the Caribbean where we're mountainous so we can go in, for the Marshall Islands, for Kiribati, for Tuvalu, there is no retreat. Sea level rise will completely obliterate the island. So, you know, it wasn't 1.5 wasn't a symbolic victory. It was really a life and death, a question of life and death. So it was really us drawing our line in the sand and saying that this is really the point where we either exist or we don't exist. So 10 years later, there's a certain amount of happiness to see that 1.5 is what the world has universally accepted as the long-term temperature goal. There isn't talk of 2 degrees Celsius anymore. But there is disappointment in that we are now very clearly on the way to overshoot of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we didn't have to get there. In Paris, we had a very good opportunity to do the kinds of things that needed to be done to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius, to keep us within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And unfortunately, the world didn't do it. Some countries did. The small island developing states who together contribute very minimally to global greenhouse gas emissions. The Caribbean as a whole contributes, less than 0.2%, and they've all made very ambitious commitments to reduce their emissions of greenhouse gases. But the countries that needed to do the same have not. I mean, we're still seeing fossil fuels subsidized to the trillions of dollars. IMF put out a report, I think 2 years ago, saying that fossil fuels are being subsidized at a rate of $13 million a minute. That's not Greenpeace or Oxfam that said so. That's the IMF, $13 million a minute. So we're still seeing greenhouse gas emissions that are off the chart. We haven't seen the peak that we should have seen. So that's a disappointment that we have not done the recalibration that was necessary. This year was a good year for us, not temperature-wise, but legally. The two reports, the two advisory opinions, the first by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and even more so the International Court of Justice, have said now that 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a moral obligation, it's a legal obligation. That countries have a legal responsibility to align their NDCs with the best available science. Their mitigation has to be aligned with the best available science. And 1.5 degrees Celsius the NDCs have to be aligned with that. So we now have something. You know, when we went into Paris, everybody thought that the Paris Agreement was a gentleman's agreement, that we were talking about nationally determined contributions, not commitments. Well, the International Court of Justice has said very clearly that, no, this is a legal obligation. And you're now responsible for not just transboundary harm, but there is also a question of intergenerational equity, that you now can be held responsible for what you're doing to impact the lives of young people later on. And I think that is a very powerful thing that we have to use. So for me, there are now two tracks that the negotiations must travel along. The scientific path, and you know, climate has always been based on scientific arguments. It's not conjecture, it's not opinion, it's science. It's hard science, as the IPCC reports put out. But now there's a legal foundation that we have, and I think that's where there's another set of discussions that have to take place to see how we hold polluters responsible for what they're doing, because we clearly cannot continue along this track. We can't be talking about overshoot as if it's just an abstract topic. Overshoot will mean loss of livelihoods, it will mean loss of lives, it will mean a totally different way of life for many people, not just in small island developing states, but we're already seeing it in the developed countries. We're seeing droughts, we're seeing forest fires, we're seeing flooding. So it's kind of a mixed bag. There's some level of apprehension, but also some level of comfort, if I can use comfort ever to speak about this, that at least the legal community is accepting what we've been saying for some time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Noting Piers has to push off, I'm going to ask you one question before you, one question. Given the current emission trajectories and your findings on the indicators, what are the most urgent issues or levers of near-term action to avoid the scale and time frame of potential overshoot from your perspective?
Well, yeah. So it is primarily kind of fossil fuel emissions of carbon dioxide, and then kind of methane. Those two things can potentially come down very rapidly, and if they do over the next 5 years, they can really kind of halve that rate of temperature change. So, and these are the things that are kind of fixable. I mean, we said kind of surface transport now is cheaper and better by electric cars, and we do know that the cheapest form of electricity generation is now renewables. So it ought to be in really everyone interested to do those things and to get on top of your kind of methane if you're fossil fuel producer. That is of economic kind of benefit to that actual kind of company. So these things are very easily kind of fixable. So yeah, so it always kind of surprises me when people say it's too expensive or it's too difficult to do. It is just the kind of vested interest, I think, that is really preventing those transformations.
So a lot of it is about the money flows. So I am then going to go. Thank you very much, Piers. So on the finance side, and Simona, we're 5 years into the implementation of the Paris Agreement, but you also had a role to play in the 2030 agenda. This year has been quite difficult on finance. It's a year of constrained public finance. Vast majority of developed countries have reduced their ODA. How can development planning and finance, or the global finance community, adapt to integrate climate impacts more robustly, and also to think more clearly about how they can implement development actions that don't undermine gains that have been made?
Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you, Climate Analytics, for organizing this debate. At the United Nations, we are looking at those 10 years from the adoption of the Paris Agreement with mixed feelings. So first of all, we think we've built global awareness over the climate threat, the issues of global warming and the impact on livelihoods, on our future as humanity. We've created a series of institutions to carry this agenda forward. We continue to pioneer the annual climate summits, although we settle on much less than we should. So we have seen quite disappointing outcomes of climate summits most recently. But overall, I think we are on a pathway of maintaining, keeping pressure high. Commitments are declining, and that's primarily your point. I think we have an issue of definition when we talk about climate finance. There shouldn't be climate finance as a distinct finance track from the mainstream finance. Article 2.1 of the Paris Agreement calls for the necessity of aligning climate finance with the pathways to all finance with the pathways towards ensuring that we keep on track on the 1.5, and now the same applies to the net zero commitment. In reality, though, climate finance remains a distinct, projectized, primarily directed with some country priorities, not necessarily mainstreamed across all of the finance. We still do not have general climate markers that countries, as well as international financial institutions, could look at and use into directing finance towards climate goals, an area in which we absolutely need to work together. We also see quite diverse environment of standards that are being reported against with no interoperability, no clarity as to how those are calibrated to the net zero achievement. Talking about finance, over the last 10 years, we've seen an increase of debt significantly on vulnerable countries. Unfortunately, ODA is declining tremendously, and we see reliance on ODA declining in parallel at the same speed. Investment is still not necessarily supported by country strategies on their NDCs. We believe that aligning some of the frameworks to ensure financing from all sources are targeting NDCs is an area in which we are supposed to work more together. At this point in time, countries operate on multiple strategies. There is an NDC strategy, there is an integrated national financing framework that countries are using, climate, ocean strategies, not necessarily aligned with one another and not creating pathways for investors that international financial organizations can de-risk by their presence to see more private financing addressing those issues. I'll refer very briefly to the problem that small island developing states have. I'm looking into the room to some known faces, colleagues who have worked on measuring climate finance versus debt servicing, ODI, my colleague Emily Wilkinson here in the room, and some others. The main issue is that we continue to hold small island developing states, vulnerable states, accountable against paying, servicing debts that are in large part inherent. And that's what the multidimensional vulnerability index is meant to demonstrate. Geography, position on the map of the world, exposure, those factors come with an economic and fiscal cost that ultimately increases debt. And I'm not going into all the details on the MVI unless you tell me that that's important now. But overall, what we want to do with the MVI, and luckily it is in the Compromiso de Sevilla, it is in the agenda for small island developing states, is to distinguish between losses that countries are causing, self-inflicting, versus losses that are inherent, coming from their very specific geography, smallness, exposure, remoteness, and also lack of human capacities to address their needs. So I would think that we are not at the point to lose all hopes. Financing for climate is mainstream financing, budgets, vertical funds, loans, concessional loans, everything needs to be aligned, calibrated with the net zero, and that's where we need to have a joint effort together, as many of you assist countries directly, or your representatives of your countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. I'm going to invite my colleague to join the panel, Zarar Khan. He's a senior expert who's just recently joined Climate Analytics, and he works on integrated assessment models, and so is going to also speak to some of our work on modeling and international benchmarks. But before I come to you, Bernd, thank you for joining. From your perspective in the UNFCCC and the mitigation division, in a year of NDC submissions, you're leading the charge on pulling together the NDC synthesis report. And so tomorrow, the SG Summit will play somewhat of a role, but there are a lot of countries who have submitted NDCs thus far this year. And the expectation is that NDCs were to reflect on the GST findings. How were you going about articulating the extent to which countries are integrating those findings, or the expectations, especially of Para 28? And how might this, do you think, influence the framing of ambition going into COP, thinking about kind of 10 years on from the Paris Agreement? It's a lot there, sorry.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Fran, for having me, and thanks everyone for joining today. But I think also, and you mentioned that, Ambassador, the Paris Agreement gave us a platform to move forward. It's not perfect. It wasn't perfect. There were many more opportunities, as you said. But it gave us a platform to move forward and to move these goalposts forward step by step. And I think this will happen this year again. And we hope with the report we can contribute to that. We look at all NDCs as they come in. We're not interpreting them. We take them as they come. And we put it down so to inform everyone who goes to the COP and who negotiates, and inform you to take it and push the goalpost further again. And I think that's super important. And what we currently do is really going through all of them, and the question on the GST is absolutely valid. The good thing is governments have to report on it. It's part of what is called the ICTU guidance. It's part of what needs to be in an NDC. And what we see so far is also that they are doing this. And again, this is fantastic. However, as also with Paris, this is not perfect. But it is, again, a step forward. And I think we are looking at how this is reported, and we take it all together and sum it up. So we're not pinpointing individual countries. You will get an overview of how do they in total report on that. And then we will dive into each of these aspects. So throughout the report, you will see references to the GST, because the GST is more than just 28. 28 is a very significant part, but it also comes with the other elements. And I think 28 should not be seen without the support coming in, without the funding coming in, without the cooperation that is needed for that. But we will elaborate on that, based on what governments report, and give this kind of overview to everyone, to take it forward. I think because over these last days, there's so many new NDCs coming in. That's fantastic. I'm looking forward to tomorrow. I'm also terrified, because on one hand, we want as many NDCs as possible. On the other hand, that means for my team, a lot of work, and COP is just around the corner. So I'm torn, but I actually prefer having a lot of NDCs coming in. So what we saw so far is really that in those NDCs that we have and we analyzed already, is that governments are responding to the GST, and with that, it's really showing again that this process, slow and grinding as it is, and also always frustrating as it is setting new goalposts each time. And I think this is absolutely important, that we are not stopping where we are right now. We take it and we say, okay, let's talk about the next step. We need to do more, because as Piers and Bill mentioned, we are not where we need to be. So we need to move forward. We need to push now for the next level, and I think we have a good basis for that. But now the next step needs to come in I think 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Bernd. To go on your point on the access to finance issues, I agree that one of the critical issues is creating a space for countries to actually transition, build resilient ecosystems, national economies. And so, Ambassador Fletcher, You know, you've worked a lot with youth, with climate justice across the region, and more broadly. To Simona's point on the necessity to think about finance and climate risk throughout the development portfolio, throughout development finance, throughout infrastructure projects, et cetera, how have you seen or could national strategies and be responsive to finance to ensure, one, that vulnerable communities aren't left behind, but also create space for investment? Because that's one of the hardest things, especially in SIDS.
Yeah, it's the challenge is to ensure that every sector recognizes and factors in the impact of climate change. In the Caribbean, there isn't a sector that's not vulnerable to climate change, particularly the main economic sectors, the sectors that we depend on: tourism, agriculture. These are the ones that are extremely vulnerable to climate change. But also you have infrastructure, you have water. Water is one that probably gives me the greatest cause for concern, having at one point been a minister of responsibility for water. And I know, I can see the impacts of climate change, the impacts of variability in the water cycle on the water supply in the Caribbean, that there isn't one country, maybe with the exception of Dominica, that can claim to be relatively safe where water insecurity is concerned, and water insecurity that's exacerbated by climate change. So one of the things that the governments have to do is to mainstream adaptation into every single sector. The point that you raise is an extremely important one, is to ensure also that there's congruence among all of these studies that have been done. So you have national adaptation plans, you have NDCs, and sometimes you have Ministry of Tourism that might be doing a tourism resilience plan, but they're not talking to each other. So you have plans that have been developed by ministries and public services that have resource deficiencies, that have insufficient human resources, but still spending a lot of time developing policies, developing plans, developing strategies that are not congruent, that are not synchronized. So I think the first thing is, yes, to ensure that congruence, ensure that there is a whole of government and a long-term approach to climate resilience, which I have not seen in, maybe with the exception of the government of Dominica, which was forced to do it when the Prime Minister announced after Hurricane Maria that he would very boldly, very optimistically, turn Dominica into the first climate resilient country in the world. Anybody who's been to Dominica would know how challenging that is. Dominica is probably one of the most mountainous Caribbean islands. But because the Prime Minister announced this as his moonshot goal, then the government of Dominica was forced to develop a national climate resilience plan that tried to bring everybody together. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to ensure that it's not just government and the public sector that's involved in adaptation and building resilience. Too often in the Caribbean, these initiatives are concentrated within the government, so they're very top-down. And the people who can really build resilience at the community level, and that's why I've done a lot of work wearing another hat with the Caribbean Climate Justice Project and a group that we set up last year called Youth IRE, Youth Innovators for Renewable and Inclusive Energy, is to try to empower civil society, particularly young civil society, to understand that they have a role in all of this and that they must organize themselves in a manner that would allow resources to flow directly to them, not through a ministry and then to them, but directly to them so that they can build their own resilience. And I think that is part of the missing equation, the missing element of the equation in the Caribbean. There's still too much government involvement. It's still too much public sector heavy. Not even the private sector, I think, has appreciated just what its role is and what its responsibility is. And civil society is still fledgling, it's still developing. So that's part of the challenge that we have now, is to create that space so that all parties can be involved in helping to build resilience and to cause government to understand that it has to work with them, that every project does not have to be implemented by a government agency, but that there is need to work through civil society to get some of that done. I know Canary has been doing some excellent work in trying to mobilize civil society across the Caribbean around the question of climate justice. We need to have a lot more of that so that civil society is working in partnership with governments. There's still insufficiency of finance, so the finance that is available to us is still not enough. There's still too many hoops that we have to jump through to be able to access that finance, and by the time you access the finance, the problem that you're trying to solve has magnified by 2 or 3 times, so there is that challenge. But I think that is something, ensuring that there is congruence among the various partners and that you build capacity so that everyone can be part of this battle. Because if it's just left to government, it won't happen. It would happen, at least not at the scale that needs to happen. So that's why building civil society is so important.
Thanks, Ambassador. So in addition to finance, developed countries and major emitters are also responsible for another aspect of the Paris Agreement, and that's major emission cuts. And as we've seen so far, those are not adequate to date, nor are they 1.5 aligned. And so going to Zarar, Climate Analytics produces a significant amount of analysis, international benchmarks, especially against the 1.5 temperature limit, through the Climate Action Tracker, obviously with our partner, but also with our National Pathway Explorer. And so how do you see these tools, how can they be utilized, not just by governments, but by other actors in those countries to help put pressure and to push the ambition to a space where it is 1.5 aligned? Is that, what are your thoughts there?
Thank you, Fran. Yeah, I think tools like the CAT, the Climate Action Tracker, and the National Pathway Explorer are really important, and they offer two key kind of advantages: this accountability and accessibility, I'd say. And just in general, like, there's so much data that's being produced. I mean, I'm a modeler myself, but every year we get overwhelming amount of data, modeling results, but also information and misinformation. And it's just really hard to handle and act on those things. So I think a tool like the CAT, which we've been tracking, I mean, it's been around for almost 15 years now, offers a compass. It's there. It kind of translates all of this information into exactly what these things actually mean. And it translates what countries are saying they'll do and what that means in a global perspective. So what does that actually translate to? And it says there very clearly right now that based on the current kind of pledges and commitments, we're going to end up, as Piers also said, in a 2.1 degree world with uncertainty almost to 2.7. So we're going to cross those thresholds. And that's something really easily digestible. It's there in one place. So I think it forces us to makes the different countries and their kind of commitments accountable for what they're saying. And then if the CAT does that, then the NPE, for example, is the counterbalance to that. It offers how you get to 1.5. So the CAT shows, are you 1.5 compatible? But then the tool like an NPE shows how you can get there, and that kind of goes into deep dives into countries and what Piers was saying, how you can get those levers, like power sector decarbonization, and then electrifying the end-use sectors in industry, transport, and buildings. So a lot of countries might not have that capacity, and that's what the NPE then does. This is your pathway, and that's how you can get there. So I think they really balance each other out and are very powerful together.
Thank you. So speaking of tools, and after this question, I'm going to open up to the floor. So if you have any questions, please have those ready. Simona, looking out to COP30 and what NDCs have been saying thus far, including the investment needs that are out there and what NDCs have been costed to date, what financial commitments or frameworks do you think supervisory bodies, multilateral development banks, would you like to see put forward that recognize the necessity to invest further in this space?
Thank you so much. I first want to add a point to the previous speakers. In 2024, we unified the frameworks under which reporting of emissions is taking place. We operationalized the enhanced transparency framework to ensure that we do not look at emissions across various repositories, but we have them all together, and then we can link them up with the IPCC, so that IPCC reports are faster, are much easy to adopt by the member states, because they would align. They would be reflecting the numbers that came out from the reporting of countries. This is a significant step forward. I don't know about tomorrow, but I hear that not too many countries have yet completed reporting on NDC 3.0. So there were 12 by the end of February or something. and then some 20, 30 countries mid-year. So let's hope that that is going to continue. So we will get to the truth. We will have numbers showing what exactly is being emitted. This is of critical importance. We also have the recent progress on carbon markets, on global carbon markets, that would enable countries to monetize some of these carbon offsets, the ecosystem service, if you wish, of their natural assets. Natural assets, apart from serving vital functions, also create carbon offsets that could generate revenues for countries. So that's another important thing. I would say that what is critically important, and I see more alignment between the Compromiso de Sevilla as well as COP30 and G20, is dealing with that. We need to agree that most of the transition that countries need to make is made on their own resources. So national budgets matter, borrowing matters. Countries still borrow at rates, interest rates that are in some cases above their growth rates. For developing countries, actually, that's a line. So that's their ability to borrow. So dealing with that, after Compromiso de Sevilla, we have a borrower forum. It's the very first time when borrowers have a mechanism of their own to mirror the Paris Club of creditors. So borrowers are coming together to address debt servicing issues, to restructure their debt, to hopefully expedite the debt treatment common framework that is so slow. And the MPI comes in, I'm going to say it once again, into that. So the index is universal. It was adopted by the General Assembly last year and would allow good analysis of the debt that countries need to service, hopefully taking out everything that is not caused by themselves. And that applies to small island states, but also to all of the other countries. As mentioned, this is universal in nature. So we look into an approach to that would allow countries to be able to move forward so that we can still have a future together. Net zero is getting farther and farther. No matter the optimism, I think we need to be realistic. We are going to be forced to adapt to a new world. Hopefully with a limited impact on lives and biodiversity. Coming from the Pacific, unless those frameworks align, we have 3 of the 4 exclusively atoll countries in the Pacific, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Tuvalu, that will not be above the water in some decades from now, unless serious work is being done. And if I may, the ICJ needs an implementation framework. It's a great advisory that countries have secured. It's primarily binding in the customary law space, not the international, it's non-binding by the book of international law, but in customary international law, when we speak about doing no harm, when we speak about human rights, including the right to development and the right to clean environment, clean and safe environment, the advisory gives some very good lines of action. We would like to see together a way of taking the ICJ advisory to action. Yes, it is about money, but I think we are much shorter in political will than we are in funding.
Thank you, Simona. And so I'm going to open the floor out for any questions that might have for the panel. In any case, I have some additional ones in my back pocket. Yes, Emily, do we have a roaming mic? Yeah. And please, I mean, I know Emily, but please introduce yourself and from where you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Emily Wilkinson from ODI, a global think tank based in London. I was wondering if the panelists had a view on how the ICJ advisory opinion might directly influence the negotiations, so COP30, or whether it's something you do think should influence the negotiations, and in what way? Because I mean, we're clear that it's important. It's a very important advisory opinion. Maybe it will, as Simona says, we need sort of framework for implementation. But in the short term, have there been any responses from developed countries that would make you think that actually, there may be some impact, maybe having some impact already?
Take any other questions from the floor, and then I'll give you guys a minute to think about it. Other questions? Please, Dr. Oppenheimer in the front.
Michael Oppenheimer, Princeton University. You made a comment a while ago that there wasn't enough alignment between, and you could think about this, I guess, as finance, but you could also think about it in terms of substance, actual activities, between the climate goals and a bunch of other goals, presumably, although you didn't say so, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's as if there's too much to achieve at once, and therefore it's inefficient. Do you have a suggestion for one thing to improve the situation?
All right. Any other questions for now? Dr. Fletcher, do you want to take the one on the ICJ? And then, and we have one more question, please.
Thank you very much, all panel members, for the interesting presentations. Some extent, the 1.5, the way we present, it seems really the right target which we were aiming to be in, but that's not the case. Even with 1.5, the impact will continue. So I think we should not really all put that as really an ambitious target that we all should aim to be in. It's as a result of late action. So with that, the impact of 1.5 globally versus at national, if you cascade it down into national and local level, it's really different. So what's your perspective in terms of, especially, for instance, climate analytics? What are you thinking in terms of really translating that, the impact of the 1.5 to the local level for small island states, least developed countries? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take the response to that, and then we'll go for a second round. So Ambassador Fletcher, and then Simona.
Okay, where the ICJ opinion is concerned, as I said in my opening remarks, this is now not an issue anymore of what we should do. Those of you who are in Paris would know the nuance that I'm talking about. It's what we shall do. I don't know whether you know, but the entire Paris Agreement almost unraveled at the very last minute because there was one word that the Americans objected to. John Kerry said that he could not sign the agreement because it said should. And that should had to be changed. It said shall. And shall had to be changed to should because shall meant that you have to do it. Should meant that it's discretionary. So at the very last minute, there was a big uproar. It's clear now that the ICJ has said that you shall align your mitigation with the best science possible. You shall ensure that your NDCs are 1.5 aligned. And I think we have to bring that spirit into the negotiations. We have to ensure that people understand that finance for loss and damage is not charity. It's not discretionary. It's not something that you'll do if you are able to. You have caused the harm. You're the one who is directly responsible for the transboundary harm that countries in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and in the East region are experiencing. So you have a legal responsibility. So I think, when we negotiate, we have to negotiate from that basis. Now, how the developed countries are reacting, I think one or two developed countries, the UK in particular, said that it is still reviewing the advisory opinion to determine its reaction to it. I don't expect to see a flurry of enthusiasm coming from the developed countries about the advisory opinion because it clearly says what small island developing states and least developed countries have been saying all along, that you are the ones responsible for this, so you have to take action on this. It deals with the question, that very troubling paragraph 51 in the decision that accompanied the Paris Agreement that said that nothing in Article 8, which is the article that spoke to loss and damage, implies liability and compensation. It says, yes, it does. So paragraph 51, and again, it was something when we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, and the developed countries insisted on paragraph 51 coming in, and Damon was there because Damon was part of the technical team that supported me. Now he's wearing another hat. But the developed countries were insistent on that line about liability and compensation. All the legal advice that we got said, no, that does not negate your response. That does not negate your rights in international law, and the ICJ has said that. So I think what we have to do as negotiators is to bring that spirit, bring that knowledge into the negotiations. But I think the real value of the advisory opinion is not so much going to be within the negotiations, not just yet. It's what hopefully it will spur outside of the negotiations, outside of that ecosystem. I always like to draw a parallel with what happened in the tobacco industry in the United States in the 1990s, where the tobacco industry was claiming very clearly, it was denying the science and saying that cigarette smoking was not causing cancer, that this was a personal choice. You chose to smoke, so therefore if you got cancer, that's on you, it's not on us. The Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement in 1998 put a light to this. It said, no, you are responsible, you have to do something, and you will now have to go into your pocket and pay $200 billion in class action suits all over the place. I think that's how we will test the advisory opinion, the jurisprudence that will be built up as a result of that foundation, where maybe not so much government, but civil society now starts taking some of these polluters to court and testing that advisory opinion and saying, okay, if they are responsible, then can we make them now legally responsible and financially responsible? I think when that starts coming in, and you start seeing some judgments coming out, then the world will have to pay attention. Right now, the advisory opinion is just that. It's just that. It's an advisory opinion. It's not law in certain jurisdictions. So how we work that and how we encourage civil society to use that advisory opinion, sometimes to take their own governments to court. And I think that's the one that we haven't also factored in, because it means that if you are a government in a small island developing state and you're doing something that is inimical to the interests of your people, then you can now also be taken to court on the basis of that advisory opinion.
Thank you, Ambassador. Simone, over to the question from Dr. Oppenheimer.
Yes, and before that, if I may, Ambassador Fletcher made very, very good points here. I just wanted to say that the ICJ advisory actually opened the door to a totally new approach to climate finance. It revived the climate justice concept. When the Paris Agreement was adopted and in follow-up negotiations, the principle of no shame, no blame was what governed discussions in every single room. Now, the ICJ speaks actually about some blame and some shame, and for the very first time, we have a new ground to discuss loss and damage. Loss and damage wasn't meant to be voluntary. Loss and damage was in terms of financing. Loss and damage was meant to be built on the principle of climate justice. So I think if member states make a common front to take this ICJ into a series of action points, for the upcoming summit, there might be some very interesting negotiations on how to pursue the climate agenda moving forward. Professor, thank you so much for the question. There is one good step forward that was made on that particular point of no alignment among various frameworks, which came from the Compromiso de Sevilla. Compromiso de Sevilla spoke about the need to align national, at the country level, development is practically local, action is local, to align all the frameworks, naming them, the Integrated National Financing Framework that puts together all the financing architecture that the country needs to be able to fund its goals, together with the investment policy review with NDCs, so we will see that happening at the country level. But the reality is exactly as you mentioned, we are operating on a set of global goals that are not 2050 calibrated. When the SDGs were adopted, we were also negotiating the Paris Agreement. They came at the same time. So calibrating global goals to the new agenda is something that is being considered now as the SDG progress is being reviewed. Some of the targets are being reviewed, and definitely the new set of goals will need to be calibrated. We cannot talk about climate finance as a distinct action point. At the country level, where we all are present one way or another, the alignment could be much more factual. We look into what exactly will take the country to reducing its emissions to the point that is no harm to the world, that nature can absorb, and then align all of the goals and all of the financing. The money is the problem. How the money moves. If the money does not move with climate as a primary objective, looking at the OECD biomarkers, we still talk about primary climate objectives, significant or contributing to. Everything needs to be primary climate financing at this point in time. We are beyond emergency in terms of what needs to be done. So we'll see that happen, but I think we all have a responsibility together whenever we meet at the country level to make that happen. Thank you.
Bernd and Suraj, you want to complement anything?
Yeah, just very briefly also on the point of integration, and I think we need to, when looking at the new rounds of NDCs that are coming in, we see much more integrated approaches than only 5 years ago. And I think we need to appreciate that the Paris Agreement for now is only 10 years. I'm not saying that all this is new, but my son is 13. He doesn't appear to be very integrated or aligned. He's kind of still very wild, no? and I think over time, this is something that is really happening and that we see only within like the last 5 years already. And you see it in the NDCs, you see it in the conversations that we have on how to start integrating, on how to connect the dots, on how to think more globally and more integrated. So I'm actually very, very positive that this trend moves forward and that we are all learning by doing, and therefore the work you're doing is also so fantastic and important by starting to look holistically.
We are going to have to wrap up, but I wanted to go to the last question as well in terms of what climate analytics does at the national level in response to kind of understanding what impacts and risk looks like at 1.5 and beyond, and how one could respond to that. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have offices in different regions, but we also work across different teams working at a national level. An example is in St. Kitts and Nevis at the moment. We're supporting them in developing a loss and damage strategy. And at the moment that is looking at what are the risks across sectors at different temperature pathways, and then kind of co-creating across sectors what the response to those risks is. Is it critical infrastructure? Is it agriculture? Is it tourism? Is it education? Is it health? And what is the response that needs to be taken at a government level? Is it a 1 and 2 year time frame? Is it a 5, 10, 20 year time frame? But those are things that we discuss in a very bottom-up way with a series of different stakeholders over a longer period of time, because that's not something that you can necessarily have a conversation of in 4 months. Some of these issues are very new to a lot of people, and to also think beyond a 5-year policy time frame is also a very difficult conversation to have sometimes. And that's something that's going to be happening in a lot of countries, especially in SIDS and LDCs who are extraordinarily vulnerable. We are going to wrap up, and I have to hand over to Ruana, my colleague, who's going to close out our conversation today. And so thank you all very much for your comments, your inputs. Please stay afterwards. So if anybody else wasn't able to ask their question, they can tackle you in the reception afterwards. So thank you very much, and I very much appreciate your time, and give them a round of applause. And Ruana, over to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Good evening. First of all, as Fran has said, we know that this is a very busy week, and today is probably one of the busiest days of this week, so thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much to the panel for all of your insights and expertise. I certainly have learned a lot today, and I hope that you all have received some good food for thought, some thought-provoking ideas, aside from some very, very sobering facts about where we are in terms of tracking in relation to the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. So I have the perhaps unenviable task of closing off this evening and ensuring that we are not going to part ways wishing for the rapture to come as soon as possible. I don't know if you heard it was supposed to happen today. I'm so glad we're still here. Thinking about, what's happening down at UNHQ, the opening of the general debate this morning, some of the statements that were made, I think it's fair to say that, we've certainly heard enough today to dampen our spirits and to weaken our resolve. Even as warming continues to rapidly change the conditions of human life on this planet, denial of this lived reality seems to be making a resurgence. All while we continue to bear witness to brutal genocide, war, and the subjugation of people for profit the world over. I'm thinking about the situation in Gaza, the situation in Afghanistan, in Congo, even as the new iPhone 17 just came out, the situation in Haiti, the situation with our sisters in Iran. Our struggles as a species are, however, not separate from each other. We do not have to look too closely to see where exactly they interconnect and to find a denial of shared humanity, extractivist economic policy, and the pursuit of profit without end at the heart of the polycrisis situation that we're in today. We live in unprecedented times, but certainly the root causes of our struggles are sadly not without precedent. So I want to end this evening with a focus on what might be hopeful. In my own personal life, and I think Piers referenced this, if you're involved in this work, you have to be an eternal optimist. So searching for hope is something that I'm doing daily. And I've only been involved for about 15 years now. There are those who have certainly been around much longer than I have. One of the resources that I've come across recently that I want to share with you is a book by Dr. Jane Goodall called The Book of Hope, A Survival Guide for Trying Times, where she says that there are 4 things that continue to give her hope in this very, very troubled world. The first is the amazing human intellect. And we've heard from some leading climate scientists today, and there's a lot of that very, very amazing human intellect gathered in this room. The resilience of nature. We know for sure that the earth will find ways to carry on. What we don't know for sure is what our place will be in it when various ecosystems collapse. The power of young people, which we have ample demonstration of. Jimmy spoke about this, the story of how the advisory opinion came to the ICJ in the first place is a story of the power of young people, perhaps our most important and least tapped resource in this struggle. And then finally, the indomitable human spirit, speaking to those of us either too stubborn or too crazy to stop doing what we're trying to do here. So I offer you this as well as a means of reflection for your own work in your own lives. The title of the event today is focused on what will keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit within reach. And perhaps in some scenarios, we're actually talking about how we can limit the degree and duration of overshoot. So we know we have to address several gaps. We've heard about the gap in mitigation ambition. We know there's a financing gap, which is undermining our efforts to build resilience and to actually be able to do the adaptation that we need to do. I would also offer 3 other gaps for consideration as we close today. In the Pacific our colleagues speak about facing strong headwinds as a metaphor for describing the difficult political realities we face in the context of any climate discussion. The quiet part that isn't said out loud is that we sail into those headwinds anyway. Courage. Courage is a gap that we need to fill. I think I heard Zorar, as well as Piers, as well as Simona maybe, mention the issue of truth. What is the truth? How do we support it? Where do we find it? In a world that seems filled to the brim with misinformation, we had Piers say very clearly that some of what we heard today on one of the largest, most watched, viewed stages in the world was not true. So a resolve to defend the truth in the face of misinformation is also a gap that we need to address. And we have the science as our flag bearer of fact and our greatest lever for advancing further action. I've been sitting back really fascinated just thinking about the IPCC and the work of the IPCC and how we've shifted from it's all a hoax to it's not a hoax, but we have some time. Let's go for 2 degrees. 1.5 degrees is too hard. To, oh my God, it's too depressing. Look away. Look away. The scientists, we can't deal with what they're telling us. To, now we're back to it's a hoax again. That's an interesting pipeline. But through it all, the facts remain. And the messages have only gotten clearer and clearer as the technologies have advanced. And one message should really stand above them all, and that is that we already have the technological and economic capacity to reduce fossil fuels and other greenhouse gas emissions rapidly. We heard Piers say it. What we need is the political will to get it done. We heard Simona say that as well. The third gap, and we've spoken a lot about the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, and that opinion has gone some way in helping us to understand what it's really going to take to shift us from where we are to where we need to be. It explains where the obligations lie, what is the appropriate duty and standard of care. Spoiler alert, the standard of care is stringent. But this gap in terms of justice, climate justice, remains wide and deep. And it's one that must be addressed if any progress we make on the climate crisis is to be deemed sustainable. So I wanted to end with a quote by Theodore Parker that was made popular by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." So thank you all once again. Please don't run away. We'd love to engage with all of you. After this, we have some light refreshments that have been chilling, waiting for us to finish here. Have a good evening. Thank you again very much.